love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, now that we know that, we should go and live just fine, right? End of message. And most people will go, oh, that's the greatest message you've ever preached. But it was really short. Why is it so hard to love our neighbor as ourselves? Isn't it hard? This last week, I spent 3 days literally on the road traveling, taking my youngest daughter to school in Dallas, Texas. And it was a great time. It was an emotional time. But it was also a long time behind the wheel of the car. And of course, I'm trying to get ready for Sunday. So I'm mapping out a message in my head. And I literally spent hours, like 20 plus hours, trying to plan out things in my head for what I'm going to say this day. And I remember, as I was talking about neighbor, thinking about neighbor and being neighborly and loving your neighbor and the people that are close to you and being kind. Remember, I'm driving around thinking those things, and I look up in the rearview mirror, and here's a guy right on my rear bumper going 70 miles an hour. And I look up in the rearview mirror and I go, what are you doing? And I kind of speed up to get another truck, and I pull over and he drives by. I'm going, use your hand! Okay, now, God, about loving your neighbor. And it didn't hit me like, you are such a doofus. Here you are thinking about how can we love our neighbor. And here a guy comes and the last thing you were is neighborly to him. Why can it be so hard? It isn't just hard for us. It was hard even back in Jesus' day. In fact, on one particular occasion, there was an expert in religious law who came to Jesus and asked him a very simple question. What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? What do I have to do to make sure I have a right relationship with God and that I am living the abundant kind of life that seems to be promised from God? And Jesus said, well, I don't know, you're an expert in the law. How do you read the law? What does it all boil down to? And the guy basically says it boils down to this. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you've answered rightly. Well, of course, Jesus would say that because that's what Jesus had already been preaching. The guy was probably familiar with things that Jesus had said. And that was Jesus' answer. He thought, I'll repeat the teacher's answer right back to him because I know I'll get a A on that one. And Jesus went, you're exactly right. Go do that and you will live. But then the story takes an unusual turn. As recorded in Luke chapter 10, in verse 29, the expert in the law says, wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Now, you wouldn't really think that that would be a very complex question, would you? But he wanted to justify himself because he knew he had a hard time loving his neighbor. And maybe he could find a loophole in the law that would make him okay rather than guilty like he suspected. And in order to answer that question, who is my neighbor, Jesus told a story. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called the story of the Good Samaritan. And the story of the Good Samaritan is answering the question, who is my neighbor, and therefore, who do I need to love like myself? And as Jesus tells the story, he addresses 3 issues endemic to the human heart that we have got to wrestle with and address if we're ever going to actually love our neighbors like ourselves. You know the story? Jesus said a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho where he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he had come to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, the Good Samaritan said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses that you may have. Now, which of the three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert of the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, then go and do likewise. Three issues that Jesus surfaced in this story, endemic to the human heart, that you and I have got to wrestle with and answer and overcome if we're ever going to really love our neighbor like ourselves. Here is the first issue that we've got to really wrestle with. Let's call it the convenience issue. This is the one that says, you know what? I really want to love my neighbor. I really want to help my neighbor, but now is just not a good time. It's not convenient right now. Maybe later. You know, it's interesting that Jesus set the story on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. The 2 towns were separated by about 17 miles of rough terrain. Jerusalem is set up on top of a hill. It was the capital city for all of the ancient Israelites. In the middle of that city was the temple, this large, ornate building that was worship central for the Jewish location. Now, the people who would serve and do all of the daily rituals in that temple were all descendants of Levi. Some of them were priests. This was actually a descendant of Aaron, one of the sons of Levi. The others were the Levites. They were people not descended from Aaron, but still from Levi. And they were the ones chosen by God to do all the duties in this temple. But there were so many descendants of Aaron, priests. There were so many other Levites that basically there were too many to do all the things that needed to be done. So they would be spread out all over the Israelite countryside. But from time to time, according to records that they would keep, they would go to a certain division of the sons of Levi, the Levites, and some of the priests, the sons of Aaron, and they say, it's about time for you to come and go to the temple and fulfill your religious duties. So they would travel from all over the countryside to do their service in the temple as priests. They did the stuff, and the Levites, they helped them do the stuff. There was a staging area for all the priests and Levites way down in the town of Jericho. It's where they would many of them would come and they would gather, they would refresh themselves, they would prepare themselves. Then when it was time to do their duty, they took the one-day journey up to Jerusalem. They would do their stuff for however long they were supposed to do it, and then they would go back down that road to the city of Jericho, where they would kind of re-gear, enter into regular life, and off they would go. So the fact that a priest and Levite are traveling down this road, everybody got it, happened all the time. And what it means is simply this. It means the priest and the Levite were either on their way to do their religious duties, or they were coming home exhausted after having performed all their religious duties. Had they stopped on the way to Jerusalem, it would have meant they were late for their duty to serve God. It would create all sorts of problems. On the way back, they would have been exhausted and tired and spent. The point is, it just wouldn't have been convenient. By the way, isn't it fascinating how some people who claim to know God can be all over doing their religious duty, and yet while being fastidious about keeping all of their religious duties and rules and rituals, they will ignore people who have genuine need. And God hates that. In fact, here's what God himself says in the book of 1 John, chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. And this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay our lives down for our brothers. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love in words or tongue, but with actions and in truth.